Welcome to the channel. Tonight's story isn't like anything you've heard before. It's a tale that has stayed with me for years, a story I've never shared in full detail until now. It's not just because it's hard to talk about, but because some things are difficult to explain, even when they've happened to you. For as long as I can remember, I've had a fascination with exploring the unknown. Not just the kind of unknown you can find on a map, but the places people refuse to talk about, locations that carry whispers of warnings, where the locals lower their voices and tell you to stay away. This story begins in one such place. The locals call it the Forest of No Return. It's an unmarked area tucked deep in the countryside, surrounded by thick woods and an unnatural quiet. There are no official records of the forest's boundaries, no signs warning you to stay out, and yet everyone seems to know it's there. They know because of the stories. Stories of those who entered and never came back. Stories of those who did come back, but could no longer speak of what they saw. I've always dismissed those kinds of tales as exaggerations, folklore meant to scare off the curious. But in hindsight, I can say with certainty, there's a reason no one wants to talk about it. I found that out the hard way. Before we start, I want to thank you for joining me tonight. If you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss what's coming next. Trust me when I say you'll want to stay tuned, especially after you hear what I'm about to share. Now, let me take you back to the first time I heard about the forest. I was staying in a small town for work, a quiet place with fewer people than streetlights. It was the kind of town where strangers stand out, and questions aren't always welcome. I overheard someone talking about the forest at a diner, just a passing mention, but it stuck with me. They spoke about it the way someone might talk about an old, abandoned house. But their tone wasn't casual. There was something final about the way they said it, like even mentioning it too loudly could stir up trouble. It wasn't long before I started asking around. People were hesitant to answer, brushing off my questions with vague warnings, "Don't go looking for it. It's not a place for outsiders." The few details I could piece together came from those willing to talk after a few drinks, cryptic comments about strange disappearances, people wandering too far and losing their way, and accounts of noises no one could explain. I wasn't convinced. A forest is a forest, I told myself. People get lost in the woods all the time. It's tragic, yes, but hardly unexplainable. But the way these people talked about it, it wasn't the kind of fear you'd expect from someone afraid of getting lost. It was deeper than that. It was the kind of fear that stays with you, that you pass on to others because you hope they'll listen when you didn't. And then, one day, I found it. Or maybe it found me. What followed? I'll leave that for the story. But I'll tell you this, if you've ever been curious about the things we're not meant to understand, about the places where logic doesn't seem to apply, then this is the story for you. You'll want to hear it all the way through. Because what I experienced in that forest, it changed me. And if you listen closely, it might change you, too. So, sit back, turn off the lights, and let me take you to a place where the rules we know no longer matter. A place that some have seen, but none have truly escaped. That thought lingered in my mind as I prepared for what was meant to be a simple weekend trip. At the time, it seemed harmless, just another adventure to cross off my list. I wasn't expecting much, really. Just a quiet hike through a patch of wilderness, a chance to clear my head, and maybe, just maybe, a glimpse of what everyone seemed so afraid to talk about. The drive to the edge of the forest was uneventful. Hours of open roads, scattered with small, forgotten towns where the air felt different, thicker, somehow. Each mile closer to the forest felt heavier than the last, though I chalked it up to nerves. After all, I was going alone. By the time I reached the forest's boundary, the sun was starting to dip behind the hills. There wasn't a sign or marker to indicate where the forest began. No fences, no gates. It simply appeared, as if the road had given up trying to go any farther. The trees loomed large, their branches tangled and gnarled like the fingers of something ancient. The silence was immediate and overwhelming. No birds. No wind. Just the faint hum of my car engine as I sat there, staring at the dark outline of the woods. I hesitated longer than I'd like to admit. Something about the forest felt wrong. But I shook it off, telling myself it was just the stories I'd heard getting to me. I grabbed my bag, double-checked my supplies, and took my first step into the trees. The temperature dropped almost instantly. Not by much, but enough to notice. The air was cool and damp, and the smell of earth was stronger here than anywhere I'd been before. I remember thinking it was strange, how quiet everything was. Even my own footsteps felt muffled, like the forest was absorbing every sound. The first hour passed without incident. The trail was overgrown but manageable, weaving between thick trunks and patches of moss-covered ground. I kept my eyes open, searching for anything unusual, odd markings, signs of old campsites, anything to suggest people had been here before me. But the deeper I went, the more it felt like I was stepping into untouched territory. That's when I noticed the first sign of something off. A tree, larger than any I'd seen so far, stood in the middle of the path. Its bark was stripped clean in places, exposing pale, almost white wood beneath. Carved into the surface were symbols, not letters, not numbers, but shapes I couldn't recognize. They were crude, almost childlike, yet deliberate. At first, I thought it might be graffiti, the kind left behind by bored teenagers. But the longer I looked at it, the less sense it made. The patterns didn't repeat. They didn't align with anything I'd seen before. I reached out to touch the marks, and for a moment, the air felt heavier, pressing down on me like an unseen weight. I pulled my hand back quickly, laughing it off to myself. "Just your imagination," I said under my breath. But the unease lingered. I kept walking. The trail grew narrower, the trees closer together. It felt like the forest was shifting, closing in around me. The path, which had been clear and easy to follow, was starting to blur. Branches overlapped, roots jutted out of the ground in jagged lines, and patches of shadow stretched farther than they should have. Then came the first sound. A crack, sharp and sudden, like a branch snapping underfoot. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned, scanning the woods behind me, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of another person. Just trees. Trees and silence. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, maybe, or a fox. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. Every few steps, I thought I could hear something faint, just at the edge of my hearing. A rustling, a whisper, a sound so faint it might not have been there at all. I pressed on, trying to ignore the growing unease. The trail, if you could still call it that, was barely visible now. My map was useless. It showed no paths, no landmarks, just a blank space where the forest should have been. I checked my GPS. Nothing. No signal. I told myself I'd backtrack soon if I didn't find anything worth exploring. But deep down, I already knew, I was farther in than I should have been. It wasn't until I stumbled upon the clearing that I realized just how far I'd gone. The trees opened up abruptly, revealing a circular patch of ground. In the center stood a structure, if you could call it that. It was more like a frame, a crude arrangement of branches tied together with strips of cloth. Hanging from it were small objects, bones, feathers, bits of metal that caught the fading light. I didn't want to get closer, but my legs moved before I could stop them. Each step felt heavier, the air colder. I could see now that the cloth strips weren't just tied, they were stained. Dark patches that could have been dirt, or something else. The bones were small, some broken, others whole, hanging from twine like ornaments. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that structure, but it felt like an eternity. I wanted to turn back, to retrace my steps and leave the forest behind. But something held me there, rooted to the spot. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't fear. It was something I couldn't explain. Something I still can't explain. And then I saw it. Just beyond the clearing, in the shadows of the trees, something moved. At first, I thought it might have been an animal. Maybe a deer, or a large bird startled by my presence. But as I strained my eyes to focus, it became clear that whatever it wasn't an animal. It didn't move like one. It was subtle, just a shift in the shadows at first, something you could easily dismiss if you weren't paying attention. But I was paying attention. I was locked in, every nerve on edge, every instinct in me screaming to turn back. Yet, I stayed. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the strange structure in the clearing had me on edge. But deep down, I knew better. There was something out there, just beyond my line of sight, moving in the spaces where the light didn't reach. I took a step back, and as I did, I heard it again, that same sound. A sharp crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. Only this time, it wasn't behind me. It was ahead, closer than it should have been. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes darted to the source of the noise, but the shadows there were still. Whatever had moved was gone. I stood frozen for what felt like minutes, straining to hear any sound, to see any sign of movement. The clearing was quiet again, the kind of quiet that felt wrong. Like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I wanted to leave, I needed to leave. But the path I'd taken to get here was already blending into the trees, the landmarks I'd marked in my mind gone as if they'd never been there. My grip on my flashlight tightened as I forced myself to move. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the ground was trying to hold me in place. I walked toward the edge of the clearing, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. But the shadows stayed still. Just as I reached the tree lean, I heard it again. The crack of a branch, followed by a low rustling sound. My heart was pounding in my chest now, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. This time, I didn't stop. I kept walking, pushing myself forward even as every instinct in me begged me to turn and run. And then I saw it again. This time, it was clearer, just a flash of movement between the trees, too quick to make out any detail. It was tall, taller than I expected, and its movements were wrong. Not smooth, not fluid. It moved like it didn't belong there, like it didn't belong anywhere. I stopped again, my breath shallow, my mind racing. Whatever it was circling me, staying just out of sight, just close enough to keep me on edge. I knew then that I wasn't alone in this forest, and whatever was out here with me wasn't human. At least, not anymore. I turned my flashlight toward the shadows, sweeping the beam across the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw something pale, like skin or bone, disappearing behind a trunk. But when I stepped closer, it was gone. I kept walking, my pace quickening as I tried to find the path back to my car. But the forest wasn't letting me go that easily. The trail I'd followed was gone now, swallowed by the trees. The map in my hand was useless. My GPS still had no signal. And the deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees were different now, their trunks darker, their branches tangled together in impossible ways. The air felt heavier, thicker, like I was walking through water. And the sounds, those faint, almost imperceptible sounds, were growing louder. It wasn't just the rustling of leaves or the crack of branches anymore. There was something else. A faint whispering, just at the edge of my hearing. Words I couldn't make out, voices I couldn't place. I stopped again, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam felt weaker now, like the darkness was swallowing it whole. And then I saw them. Eyes. 2 pinpricks of light reflecting back at me from the shadows. They were too high off the ground to belong to any animal I knew, and too still to be human. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They just stared. I took a step back, and as I did, the eyes disappeared. But the whispering grew louder. I turned and started walking faster, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I didn't care about the path anymore. I just needed to get out of the forest. But no matter how far I walked, the trees never seemed to thin. The clearing was gone, the trail was gone, and now, it felt like the forest itself was changing around me. Every time I thought I'd found a landmark I recognized, it would vanish as soon as I got closer. A boulder I'd passed earlier was suddenly on the other side of the path. A fallen tree I'd climbed over was upright again, its branches reaching skyward like it had never fallen at all. And then, I heard it. A voice. Faint, distant, but unmistakably human. It was calling my name. I froze, my mind racing. There was no way anyone else could be out here. I hadn't seen a single car on the road hadn't passed a single person on the trail. And yet, the voice was there, cutting through the silence like a blade. I turned toward the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Hello." I called out, my voice hoarse and shaking. The whispering stopped. The forest was silent again. And then, the voice came again, closer this time. My name, spoken in a tone that was almost familiar. But it wasn't right. There was something wrong with the way it sounded, like it was trying to mimic a voice it didn't quite understand. I didn't wait to hear it again. I turned and ran, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly as I stumbled over roots and rocks. The whispering started again, louder now, the voices blending together into a sound that was almost deafening. It was everywhere, behind me, beside me, ahead of me. And in the chaos, I realized something horrifying. The forest wasn't trying to trap me. It was leading me somewhere. That thought hit me like a sudden drop in temperature. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to force my way through the trees in the opposite direction. But even as I thought about it, I realized, I couldn't. The trails were gone. The landmarks were gone. Even the sounds of my own hurried footsteps seemed muffled, as though the forest itself was swallowing every trace of my presence. I wasn't lost. Not in the way you might think. I was being guided, pushed, herded towards something I couldn't see yet. The whispering had stopped again, but the silence was worse. I could hear my own breath, quick and shallow, and the pounding of my heart in my chest. And in that silence, I noticed something else. The air had changed. It was colder now, sharper, like I was walking into a place where the rules of the world didn't quite apply anymore. I kept walking because I didn't know what else to do. My legs moved on their own, carrying me forward even as my mind screamed at me to stop. The flashlight in my hand was growing dimmer, the beam barely cutting through the dense darkness. It was as if the light itself didn't belong here. And then, I saw it. Ahead of me, just beyond the trees, there was an opening. Not a clearing, but something else entirely. A void. The trees didn't thin out gradually as they would in a clearing, they simply stopped, as though the forest itself had been carved away to make space for whatever this was. I stepped closer, my legs trembling with each step. The ground beneath my feet felt wrong, softer than the packed dirt I'd been walking on, but not quite like mud. It gave slightly under my weight, almost as if it were alive. As I reached the edge of the void, I stopped. My flashlight flickered in my hand, the light sputtering like a dying candle. The air here was heavier, thicker, like it was pressing down on me from all sides. And then I saw what was waiting for me. In the center of the void, there was a structure, or at least, something that resembled one. It was tall, impossibly tall, stretching upward into the darkness where the sky should have been. It wasn't made of wood or stone or anything I could recognize. It looked organic, like it had grown there, twisted and knotted together in ways that defied explanation. Around the base of the structure were shapes. At first, I thought they were rocks or fallen branches, but as I stepped closer, I realized they weren't. They were remains. Bones. Hundreds of them, scattered around the base like offerings. Some were small, almost childlike. Others were larger, with jagged edges that suggested they hadn't been placed here gently. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. It was as if the forest itself was holding me there, forcing me to look, to take in every detail. And then, I felt it. A presence. It wasn't something I could see, not yet, but I could feel it watching me. It was everywhere and nowhere at once, like the air itself had come alive and was pressing against my skin. The whispering started again, louder this time. The voices blended together, overlapping in a way that made it impossible to tell where one ended and another began. They weren't speaking any language I recognized, but the meaning was clear. They wanted me to move closer. Against my better judgment, I took a step forward. The air grew colder with each step, the ground beneath my feet growing softer, almost wet. My flashlight flickered again, and for a moment, I thought it was going to die entirely. And then I saw it. In the shadows at the base of the structure, something moved. It was slow, deliberate, almost as if it were testing me. My flashlight caught a glimpse of it, just a sliver, a pale, smooth surface that reflected the light in a way that made my stomach turn. It wasn't skin. It wasn't anything I could describe. The whispering grew louder, the voices rising to a fever pitch. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to let me leave. And then, it stepped into the light. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It wasn't anything that should have existed. Its form was wrong, shifting in ways that didn't make sense, as though it was caught between one shape and another. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were dark, endless voids that seemed to pull everything around them into their depths. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. Or at least, I thought it was staring at me. It was hard to tell. Its form was constantly shifting, twisting, almost as if it were trying to decide what it wanted to be. And then, it moved. It didn't walk. It didn't run. It simply appeared, closer than it had been before. The whispering was deafening now, a chorus of voices screaming in my ears. My flashlight flickered again, the beam growing weaker with each passing second. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. The ground beneath me felt like it was holding me in place, the soft, wet earth clinging to my boots like it was alive. And then, it spoke. Not in words, not in any language I could understand, but in a way that bypassed sound entirely. It spoke directly to my mind, filling my head with images and feelings that weren't mine. Fear. Despair. Pain. It wanted me to stay. And in that moment, I realized something else. This wasn't just a forest. It wasn't just a place. It was alive. The trees, the shadows, the air itself, it was all part of something bigger, something that didn't want to let me go. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that thing, but it felt like an eternity. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The whispering stopped, the air grew lighter, and the forest was silent again. But I knew better. It wasn't over. Not yet. I stood there, in the suffocating silence, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My legs felt like lead, my body refusing to obey as every part of me screamed to run. The forest had gone still again, but it wasn't the kind of stillness that brought relief. It was the quiet of something waiting, watching, deciding what would happen next. I don't know how long I stayed frozen in place, staring into the darkness where that thing had been. Time didn't feel real anymore. Seconds stretched into minutes, or maybe hours, it was impossible to tell. But eventually, my legs moved, though not in the way I wanted them to. I wasn't running away. I was walking forward. It didn't make sense. My mind was screaming at me to turn back, to find a way out of this nightmare. But my body wasn't listening. It was as if the forest had taken control, pulling me deeper into its grasp with every reluctant step I took. The ground beneath me grew softer, wetter, until each step made a faint squelching sound. The air smelled different now, heavier, carrying a metallic tang that stung my nostrils. I kept my flashlight pointed ahead, though its beam was almost useless. The light barely cut through the thick darkness anymore, as though the forest itself was swallowing it whole. And then, I heard it again. That voice. It wasn't whispering this time. It was speaking, clear and deliberate, though I still couldn't make out the words. It was calling me, pulling me towards something I couldn't see. And worse, it wasn't alone. There were other voices now, overlapping and blending together in a way that made my head ache. Some were low and guttural, others high-pitched and sharp, like nails on a chalkboard. They were everywhere, above me, below me, behind me. I couldn't tell where they were coming from, but they all had the same intent. They wanted me to follow. I tried to fight it. I tried to stop, to turn around, to do anything other than keep walking toward whatever was waiting for me. But I couldn't. My legs kept moving, my body refusing to obey as the voices grew louder, more insistent. And then, I saw it again. At first, it was just a shadow, barely visible through the trees ahead. But as I got closer, it took shape. It was the same thing I'd seen before, or maybe it wasn't. It was hard to tell. Its form was shifting again, constantly changing as though it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. This time, it didn't disappear. It stayed there, waiting for me, its dark, empty eyes fixed on me as I approached. The closer I got, the harder it was to breathe. The air was thick, heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. My chest felt tight, my lungs burning as I struggled to take each breath. And then it moved. Not quickly, not suddenly. It was slow, deliberate, as though it knew I couldn't run. It stepped closer, and with each step, the voices grew louder, more chaotic. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything to break the overwhelming silence inside me, but I couldn't. When it was only a few feet away, it stopped. Its form was clearer now, though no less horrifying. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It wasn't anything I could describe. Its body was pale, almost translucent, its surface smooth and featureless except for the dark voids where its eyes should have been. It tilted its head, as though studying me, and for a moment, the voices stopped. The silence was deafening, worse than the noise had been, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. And then, it reached out. It didn't have hands, not in the way you'd expect, but something extended from its body, long and thin, almost like a shadow given form. It moved toward me, slow and deliberate, and I knew I should move, should run, should do anything to get away. But I couldn't. My legs were rooted to the ground, my body frozen as that shadowy limb reached closer and closer. When it touched me, it wasn't like anything I'd ever felt before. It wasn't cold or hot. It wasn't solid or liquid. It was wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. It was a feeling that shouldn't exist, something my mind couldn't fully comprehend. The moment it made contact, my vision blurred. Images flashed through my mind, faces I didn't recognize, places I'd never been, things that couldn't possibly be real. I saw people, countless people, standing in the same place I was now, their faces twisted in terror as they stared into the void. I saw the forest, stretching endlessly in every direction, its trees alive and writhing like they were trying to escape their roots. And I saw the thing standing before me, its form changing over and over, each shape more horrifying than the last. And then, I heard it again. That voice. Only this time, it wasn't speaking in a language I couldn't understand. It was speaking to me. "Stay," it said. The word echoed in my mind, filling every corner of my thoughts. Stay with us. I don't know where the strength came from, but somehow, I managed to pull away. The moment I broke contact, the images stopped, the voices faded, and the thing stepped back. For the first time, I felt like I could move again. My legs were weak, trembling beneath me, but they obeyed as I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I didn't care if I got lost. All I knew was that I needed to get as far away from that thing as possible. The forest didn't make it easy. The trees seemed to shift around me, closing off paths that had been open only moments before. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks reaching out to trip me at every step. But I didn't stop. And as I ran, I could hear it behind me. The voices were back, louder than ever, screaming in my ears as though they were trying to break through my mind. The thing was following me. I could feel it, its presence growing closer with every step. I don't know how I made it, but eventually, I saw something in the distance, a faint glimmer of light, just barely visible through the trees. I ran toward it, my legs burning, my chest aching, every part of me screaming in pain. And then, I broke through. The light was blinding after the darkness of the forest, and for a moment, I couldn't see anything. When my vision cleared, I realized I was standing on the edge of the road where I'd started. My car was there, just as I'd left it, the door still unlocked, my gear still inside. I turned back toward the forest, half expecting to see that thing standing at the edge of the trees. But there was nothing. The forest was quiet again, the trees still, as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. It wasn't over. Not yet. I stood there on the edge of the road, gasping for air, my body trembling from exhaustion and fear. The forest was quiet now, its shadows still and unmoving. But that silence, it wasn't a relief. It was a warning. A reminder that whatever had happened in there wasn't something I could just walk away from. My car was right where I'd left it, a comforting sight in the middle of the chaos. I stumbled toward it, my legs weak and unsteady, every part of me screaming to get inside and drive as far away as I could. My hands fumbled with the door handle, my fingers shaking so badly it took me several tries to get it open. When I finally slid into the driver's seat, I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, as if that flimsy barrier of metal and glass could keep out whatever was out there. My hands were still trembling as I shoved the key into the ignition and turned it. Nothing. The engine didn't even sputter. It was as if the car was dead, every ounce of power drained from it. I tried again, twisting the key harder this time, willing it to start. But the silence was absolute. I leaned back in the seat, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind was racing, searching for an explanation, for a solution, for anything that would get me out of this nightmare. And then I heard it. A faint sound, coming from the trees behind me. It was soft at first, barely audible over the sound of my own ragged breathing. But it grew louder, closer, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to look out the rearview mirror. At first, I couldn't see anything, just the dark outline of the forest, its shadows stretching across the road like reaching hands. But then, something emerged. It wasn't the thing I'd seen in the forest, not exactly. This was smaller, more human in shape, but there was something wrong with the way it moved. Its limbs were jerky, its gait uneven, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. And its face. I couldn't see it clearly, but I didn't need to. There was something in the way it tilted its head, the way it turned to look directly at me, that made my blood run cold. It started to move faster. My heart was pounding as I fumbled with the keys again, trying desperately to start the car. Still nothing. The figure was getting closer now, its movements growing more erratic, more desperate, as if it knew I was trapped. I threw the door open and stumbled out, my legs barely able to hold me up. I didn't know where I was going. Back into the forest wasn't an option, but staying here felt even worse. I started running, my feet pounding against the pavement as I put as much distance between myself and the car as I could. The road stretched on endlessly in both directions, the dark silhouettes of trees lining either side. I didn't know which way to go, but I kept moving, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Behind me, the footsteps grew louder, faster, like whatever was following me was gaining speed. I didn't dare look back. The road ahead was empty, endless, and I could feel my strength fading with every step. My chest burned, my legs ached, and the world around me felt like it was closing in. And then, just as I thought I couldn't run any farther, I saw it. A light. It was faint, barely visible in the distance, but it was there. A glimmer of hope in the middle of the darkness. I pushed myself harder, my legs screaming in protest as I ran toward it. The footsteps behind me didn't stop. They were closer now, almost right on top of me, and I could feel the presence of whatever was chasing me, its breath hot on the back of my neck. I reached the light just as my legs gave out, collapsing onto the ground in a heap. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. When I looked up, I realized the light was coming from a small cabin, its windows glowing with the faint orange hue of firelight. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong here, but I didn't care. It was shelter, and that was all that mattered. I forced myself to my feet, stumbling toward the door and pounding on it with what little strength I had left. "Help me!" I screamed, my voice hoarse and desperate. "Please, someone help me." There was no answer. I tried the door, and to my surprise, it opened. The interior was dimly lit, the flickering light of a single lantern casting long shadows across the room. It was empty, no signs of life, no furniture, nothing but the bare walls and floor. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me and locking it, though I knew it wouldn't do much good. My breath was still coming in short gasps as I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the room. And then, I heard it again. The footsteps. They were right outside the cabin now, slow and deliberate, circling the building like a predator stalking its prey. I could feel it out there, its presence pressing against the walls, the windows, the door. The light inside the cabin flickered, dimming for a moment before returning to its weak glow. And in that moment, I realized something that sent a chill down my spine. The footsteps weren't just outside. They were inside too. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. The fear, the exhaustion, the sheer impossibility of everything I'd seen, it had to be getting to me. But then I heard it again. The footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from somewhere deeper in the cabin. I froze, my back pressed against the door, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to believe it, but there was no denying what I'd heard. I wasn't alone in here. The light from the lantern flickered again, casting shifting shadows across the empty walls. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could swear they were just out of sight, in the next room. But there wasn't a next room. The cabin was small, barely more than a single square space. There were no doors, no hallways, nowhere for someone, or something, to hide. And yet, the sound was there, moving, circling, getting closer with every step. My heart was racing, my palms slick with sweat as I clutched at the edge of the door behind me, as if keeping it shut would protect me from whatever was happening. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. No one would hear me. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was thick, oppressive, pressing down on me like a weight. I could feel something in the air, something watching me, waiting. And then, I heard it. A voice. It wasn't like the voices I'd heard before in the forest. This one was clear, distinct, though it still carried that same unnatural quality that sent chills down my spine. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the cabin with its presence. "Why did you come here?" it asked. I couldn't answer. My throat felt dry, my mouth unable to form words. The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "Why did you come here?" it repeated, louder this time, more insistent. I don't know, I finally managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. The room grew colder, the light from the lantern dimming until it was barely more than a faint glow. The voice came again, closer now, almost whispering in my ear. You were warned. I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, every thought crashing into the next as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I wanted to say something, to ask questions, to demand answers. But before I could, the voice spoke again. You didn't listen. And then, the footsteps started again. They were slow, deliberate, circling me, but I couldn't see where they were coming from. The shadows on the walls twisted and stretched, shifting in ways that didn't make sense. The air was so cold now that I could see my breath, each exhale a cloud of mist that hung in the air before disappearing. The voice changed, shifting into something deeper, more guttural. It was no longer speaking words I could understand, but the meaning was clear. I wasn't supposed to be here. The light from the lantern flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands trembling so badly it took me several tries to switch it on. When the beam finally cut through the darkness, I realized I wasn't alone. The thing I'd seen in the forest, it was here. Standing in the middle of the cabin, its form shifting and twisting in the light. It wasn't moving toward me, not yet. It just stood there, watching, waiting. And then, I understood. This place, the forest, the cabin, all of it, it wasn't real. Or rather, it wasn't part of the world I knew. It was something else entirely, a place that existed outside of everything I understood. And I was never supposed to find it. The thing tilted its head, its dark, empty eyes fixed on me. The shadows around it moved like they were alive, stretching toward me, pulling at the edges of the light from my flashlight. You can't leave, the voice said, though the thing's mouth didn't move. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, the finality of them sinking in as the shadows crept closer. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to break free from whatever this was. But I couldn't. And then, I realized something else. The voice, it wasn't just speaking to me. It was inside me, filling my mind with thoughts and images that weren't mine. Memories of people I didn't know, places I'd never been, things I couldn't understand. It was showing me the truth. The forest wasn't a place. It was a thing, a living, breathing entity that fed on those who wandered too far into its depths. And I was just the latest in a long line of victims. I don't know how I found the strength, but somehow, I managed to move. I turned and threw open the door, the light from my flashlight cutting through the darkness as I stumbled out into the night. The forest was waiting for me. The trees loomed larger than before, their branches twisting and writhing like they were alive. The path I'd taken to get here was gone, replaced by a thick tangle of roots and underbrush that seemed to stretch on forever. But I didn't care. I ran, my feet pounding against the ground as I pushed myself forward, the shadows chasing me, the voice still echoing in my mind. You can't leave. But I had to. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I saw it, the faint glimmer of the road, just visible through the trees. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I kept going, driven by a desperation I'd never felt before. And then, I was out. I stumbled onto the asphalt, collapsing to my knees as the forest loomed behind me. For a moment, I thought it was over. But as I turned to look back, I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, peering out from the shadows of the trees. Watching. Waiting. And I knew, even as I stood and made my way back to my car, that I hadn't truly escaped. The forest had let me go, but it hadn't forgotten me. And it never would. When I reached my car, it was as if no time had passed at all. The engine started on the first try, the headlights flickering to life and cutting through the darkness like they always had. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my mind racing. The road stretched out ahead of me, empty and endless, and all I wanted was to be as far away from that place as possible. But as I pressed down on the gas pedal and began driving, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The shadows along the edge of the road seemed deeper than they should have been, darker, almost alive. Every so often, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, quick flashes of something darting between the trees, keeping pace with my car. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was exhausted, that my mind was playing tricks on me after everything I'd been through. But deep down, I knew the truth. The forest wasn't done with me. The drive back to town felt longer than it should have, the winding roads stretching on endlessly, the familiar landmarks looking unfamiliar in the dim light of my headlights. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something sitting in the back seat, waiting for me to notice it. When I finally saw the faint glow of streetlights on the horizon, I felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly brought me to tears. Civilization. Safety. Or so I thought. I pulled into the driveway of the small motel where I'd been staying, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. The parking lot was empty, the building quiet, its windows dark. I sat there for a long time, staring at the door to my room, trying to convince myself to get out of the car. When I finally did, the air outside felt different. Heavier. The familiar sounds of the night, crickets, distant cars, the hum of the motel's old neon sign, were gone. It was quiet. Too quiet. I hurried to my room, fumbling with the key as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was just as I'd left it, plain, unremarkable, the kind of place you forget the moment you leave. But it didn't feel the same. The silence followed me inside, wrapping around me like a thick blanket. I locked the door behind me, double-checked the windows, and turned on every light in the room. But even with the brightness, the shadows felt wrong. They stretched farther than they should have, creeping up the walls like they were alive. I sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands, trying to make sense of everything. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the forest. The trees, the shadows, the thing that had followed me, they were all there, waiting for me. And then, just as I was starting to convince myself it was over, I heard it. The whispering. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the air conditioner. But it grew louder, more distinct, until there was no denying it. It was the same voices I'd heard in the forest, the same incomprehensible words that made my skin crawl. I turned on the TV, the volume up as loud as it would go, trying to drown out the sound. But it didn't help. The whispering was still there, louder than the static, louder than my own thoughts. I stayed like that until morning, the sun rising slowly over the horizon, its light spilling into the room and banishing the shadows. The whispering stopped then, but the feeling of unease didn't. For the next few days, I tried to go about my life as if nothing had happened. I checked out of the motel, packed my things, and left town, driving until I was too tired to go any farther. But no matter where I went, the feeling followed me. The shadows seemed darker now, the silence heavier. Every so often, I'd hear faint whispers in the distance, just at the edge of my hearing. And at night, when I closed my eyes, I'd dream of the forest. It's been years since that night, but the memories haven't faded. If anything, they've only grown stronger. The forest is always there, in the back of my mind, waiting. And sometimes, I think it's calling me back. I'll be sitting alone in my apartment, the lights on, the TV playing softly in the background, and I'll hear it. A faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the corner of the room. Or I'll catch a glimpse of something in the mirror, a shadow that doesn't belong, a flicker of movement just out of sight. I've tried to move on, to forget about what happened. But the forest won't let me. It's not just the memories, or the dreams, or the whispers. It's the feeling that something is always watching, always waiting. The feeling that no matter how far I run, how hard I try to escape, the forest will always be with me. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if it's not just watching. If it's waiting for me to come back. If you're listening to this, take my advice, don't go looking for the forest of no return. Don't follow the stories, don't chase the rumors, don't think you can handle it. Because once it finds you, it doesn't let go. And if you ever hear the whispers, run. Run, and don't look back. Because once you've seen it, once you've felt it, once you've been touched by it, the forest is always with you. Always. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you for listening. If you've ever had an experience like this, or if there's somewhere you think no one should ever go, leave a comment below. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next. Trust me, the stories only get darker from here.